guys, it's Katie. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another book recommendations video. This has become a thing that I do like once a year. I compile all of my favorite adult books, and my last one was one of my most popular videos kind of out of the blue. And I've read a lot of other really great books since that video. So I thought I would just update you on all of my favorite adult books that I've read since making that video. Still stand by all of the recommendations in that first video. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll have a link down below, as well as all of the books that I talk about today. I think I have 9 on my list. I also think I had 9 on that list too. Cemetery. I'd love to hear down below in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, or maybe some recommendations of adult books that you've loved lately. And by adult, I literally just mean they're not young adult books or middle grade. I think I have a pretty wide variety of genres this time. We have some romance, some thrillers, some sci-fi, some paranormal. I try to organize this one a little bit better than the last one, so I'll put timestamps down below so you can jump to one genre if you're more interested in one or the other. But all of these books are so good, even if you don't usually read the genre, I think you should still try it. Before we get into the recommendations though, thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people. If you've been around on my channel for a while, you've heard me talk about Skillshare. I have been loving their creative writing, editing, and marketing classes, as well as some of their business and freelancing classes. They have such a wide variety of topics that you will never run out of classes to take, and you'll never get bored. In addition to all of the like functional, practical business ones, they also just have these like random fun lifestyle classes. One that I currently have my eye on that I think I'm gonna take next is called Happy House Plants. Pick a perfect plant. I love plants and I never would have thought that they'd have a class on it, so I'm really excited to see what they have to say. But the great thing about Skillshare is they're really dedicated to helping you learn. There's no ads on the platform. They're constantly adding new classes, and with an annual subscription it's less than $10 a month, so it's super affordable. So if it's something that you're interested in trying out for yourself, I can't recommend them enough. I'll have the link down below in my description. But without further ado, let's get into the books that I want to recommend to you today. These aren't really in any particular order outside of the genre groups. So first we're gonna do some thrillers, and some of them it's a little doubtful on the genre. They're a little bit sci-fi, a little bit thriller, but we're just gonna use blanket term thrillers. Then I have some that would just kind of be found in the general literature and fiction section in the bookstore. I have some that are more like paranormal romances, and then one that's like kind of bridging the gap between like a supernatural paranormal romance and just like a contemporary romance, and then some just flat out contemporary romances. I will admit the previous one of these videos had more variety in the genres. Apparently I was slacking a little bit in my reading diversity this year. Well, let's just get straight into the recommendations. First book I want to talk about is Recursion by Blake Crouch. I actually read this towards the end of 2019 and it's still super memorable to me. If you've been around on my channel for a while, I've recommended Blake Crouch's other book, Dark Matter, a couple of times before. I really enjoyed that one. If you've also read that and you really liked it, I think you should definitely try Recursion. I don't know if there's one that I like better, because on the one hand they're very similar, but they're also very different. So Recursion kind of walks that line between science fiction and thriller, and the reason why I say that, it has like these really heavy science fiction themes and topics, but it reads like a thriller as far as like the pacing goes. And this one's really interesting because it deals with like false memories. So basically there's this phenomenon going on called false memory syndrome. So people are basically like being psychologically tortured by remembering this life that they never lived. Like they have vivid memories of every element of this life that doesn't exist. In this other life they had kids and were married and had a completely different job, and that version of their life never happened, and one day they just wake up with a completely different set of memories alongside their real life, and it's like driving them mad. Some of them like the other version of their life so much that they can't cope with being stuck in this version. So at the beginning of the book we're like led to believe this is just like a psychological thing. These people are crazy, but there might be more to it. They may have actually lived those other lives as well. So we're following 2 main characters for most of the book. One is a cop who's investigating this, and then one is a neuroscientist, and I can't really tell you much about her without spoiling some things that happen in the book. I really loved this book. I thought it was super fast paced and there were so many twists and turns, so if you like that kind of thing, I think you'll really appreciate that here. This book gave me a headache. It's like mind-boggling trying to comprehend all of these things. It was insane. I would really recommend the audiobook. I absolutely loved the audiobook. However, if you also have the physical copy, maybe follow along with that for the first couple of chapters until you figure out what the heck is going on, because it's a little confusing to just like dive headfirst into. But yeah, this was phenomenal. Cannot recommend this highly enough. I've never read anything like this. If you haven't read Blake Crouch's books at all, would just recommend him as an author in general. Very entertaining, but also very thought-provoking. Next on my list, I have Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. If you've been around for a while, you know I love Riley Sager. Now, his books kind of walk the line between thriller and horror. So this is like a creepy, spooky thriller. If you've heard me talk about this book before, I've compared it to A Haunting of Hill House on Netflix a lot. I think they're very similar. Basically, our main character lived in this haunted house with her family for only like a week until they fled the property and never went back because they were so scared. And she was only like 6 years old at the time, so she doesn't really remember what happened, but her father's an author and he wrote a book about their experience there and he published it as nonfiction. And so this book became a huge phenomenon. It's followed her entire life. People recognize her as the girl from the book, and she really resents her father for writing this because one, she feels like he lied and that's not what happened, and two, she resents that it's followed her whole life, and three, she feels like he didn't accurately depict who she is in the book. So now that she's an adult, she goes back to this house to flip it, fix it up, and then sell it so she never has to deal with it again. And also she's trying to uncover what really happened all of those years ago. So my main warning with this book, if you're gonna go into it, if you're like half of the way through, 3/4 of the way through, and you're disappointed, stick with it. I love the ending of Riley Sager's books, so when I hit like the twists in this book, I was kind of disappointed because I feel like it didn't live up to his other books. But then once you get to the ending, it made up for it and it was okay. I really loved the atmosphere of this book. I thought it was very creepy and spooky. I just find his books very easy to read if you're newer to the thriller genre. I think he's a great author to start with. Very like beginner friendly, very fast paced, easy to read. And I read this around Halloween and I just love the atmosphere, spooky vibes and stuff, so this was perfect for me. And then the final book in this first category for our thrillers is very straight down the line, just a thriller, no other genres really put in there. That's The Night Swim. This was the most upsetting book that I read last year, but I also think it's one of the most important and intelligent and just very relevant social commentary in here. I would also recommend the audiobook for this one. So basically our main character runs a true crime podcast where she looks back on previous cases and goes through all of the facts again to let her audience decide who's guilty and not guilty. But for this newest season, she's doing something different and she's following a case while it's happening. So she goes back to the small town where this case happened. It's a rape case. This guy who is like an Olympic contender, golden boy, has been accused, and obviously no one wants to believe that. And we're following kind of two different storylines because the podcaster is also receiving letters from this girl who's like begging her to look into the death of her sister that happens like 20 years ago in the same town, also a rape case. So we're following kind of what happened to this girl's sister all of those years ago, and then also how the trial is going down in present day. If you listen to the audiobook, it has great effects of like, it sounds like you're listening to the podcast and stuff, so I really loved that. Definitely want to give you some content warnings here at the beginning though. If you're gonna go into this, not only is rape like a really heavy theme and discussed a lot throughout, there's also a couple of pretty graphic rape scenes. So I found it to be deeply unsettling, very like nauseating to read. I will say it had a bit of a slower start for me, but I would stick with it. I actually really loved the setting and the atmosphere of this book. Again, kind of had that like spooky undertone. It's in the small town on the coast. I just found it very vivid and very easy to picture the setting. Very upsetting, very important, definitely by far one of the best books that I read last year, definitely one of my favorites. So now moving into our general fiction category, I just have two books for this one, and the first one is my favorite book that I read in 2020. That was City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. This one surprised me. It did and it didn't. Like, I love Elizabeth Gilbert, but this isn't like a genre that I typically read. It's more like historical fiction. So we're following our main character, Vivian, in New York City, the 1940s, from when she fails out of college in her young adulthood and she becomes a party girl in New York City, and she befriends all of these showgirls all the way until she's like 90 years old. And so the book is structured in such a way where Vivian is telling us her life story by way of, she's writing a letter. Every time I explain this, I feel like it comes out confusing. She's writing a letter to a girl, and she knew the girl's father. So she's explaining to the girl who her father was to her. And so Vivian is very like promiscuous, party girl for the majority of the book, and lots of men come and go from her life. So we have no idea who this girl's father is going to be, and then who he's going to end up being to Vivian. So I loved this book for so many reasons. For one thing, I think the character development is really interesting to see with Vivian from when she's like 19 to 90. I love the setting, the 1940s, New York City. I thought it was really vivid. Love the atmosphere. Clearly, I'm really into the atmosphere with books. And this is a super long book, so I would really recommend the audiobook. That didn't make it feel long for me. And it's definitely slower paced, more character driven, so I wouldn't go into it expecting it to be very plot heavy or really fast paced. But Vivian ended up being the most memorable character that I read last year, and this is just something that I'm like already craving a reread, and I read this pretty recently. I know a lot of people will disagree with me on this book. They DNF'd it, they couldn't finish it, they couldn't get into it, but for some reason I loved it. Cannot recommend the audiobook enough, and I would pick it up when you're in the mood for it, when you're really like in a patient mood and you really want to like dive deep into a story and get like really immersed in it for a while. Cannot recommend this one highly enough. And then the second one in this category is called Tell Me Lies by Carola Lavering. If you've been on my channel for a while, I'm sorry, you've heard me talk about this book so much this year. So this book is again following two timelines, following our main character Lucy from when she's a freshman in college to I think 5 years after they graduate, when one of her friends gets married and they all come together again. So we're following her through the years with this like on again, off again, super toxic like situationship, like I wouldn't even call it a relationship, with this boy Steven. So on the surface, we have that story. Toxic relationship, girl trying to figure her stuff out in college, coming of age, that kind of thing. But then also there's a darker layer. And there's some things going on in the background. There are some things that have happened in these characters' past that I don't want to say too much on because I don't want to spoil you, but this book went so much darker than I was expecting, and it went so many places that I wasn't expecting it to go. This was so addicting. I read this book in like 2 days. I couldn't put it down. I always say a warning when I talk about this book that the characters are super unlikable. If you've never been in a situation and you can't relate to this book, you might just find it really annoying and not like it. But this was the fastest I read a book like all year. I couldn't put it down. I absolutely devoured it. And I think I read this in like February or March of last year, and I'm still thinking about it. It was so good. Just absolutely addicting. Now we're gonna go into some paranormal romances. The first one, very squarely in that genre. The second one kind of walks the line between paranormal and contemporary. So first, our paranormal, it's actually a serial and it's considered new adult. This is the Charlie Travesty serial. This is a vampire paranormal romance. The main character is like a vampire princess who basically gets cast out by her family and then has to figure out how to survive. There are 4 parts out for the serial right now, which is volume 1, and I believe they're coming out with volume 2 this coming summer. And I read this so freaking fast. Again, very addicting. This was exactly what I was in the mood for. If you're craving some like good vampire paranormal romance, kind of like Vampire Diaries esque, oh man, I loved this so much. I really liked the world building, and it was just fast and fun and addicting, and I couldn't stop reading until I got to the end of the 4th part. They're each about 100 pages long. When I read them, they were all available in Kindle Unlimited. I don't know if they're still there or not, but just to warn you, because I know some people like if you only read 100 pages of something, it feels kind of unsatisfying to you. So they also have a bind up, so I would recommend just reading all 4 parts back to back, otherwise I think you're gonna be unsatisfied. Very memorable characters for me. I'm really looking forward to volume 2. I will continue reading for sure. I really liked this year. This was a really pleasant surprise for me. I wasn't really expecting much when I went into this, and then I read all 4 parts in like a week. Then the other book that I kind of put in this category is A Lesson in Thorns by Sierra Simone. So this one, I didn't really know what genre to put this in. It reads very much like a fairy tale. So very like whimsical, a little bit spooky, very atmospheric. So it's like not your normal contemporary, but it's not like paranormal in the sense that there's like a supernatural creature or something in it. It's about this group of friends that does like rituals in the woods. So basically we're following our main character, Poe. She's a librarian and she goes back to this house and meets up with 3 other people who were all friends as children, but I don't think they've really seen each other since then. It's been a while since I've read this book. This is the first book in a series as well. And basically they all stay in this house and they're like reuniting, and they learn some interesting history about the property that they're on and some rituals that people used to perform, and they're like, hey, let's do it. And it's basically like an orgy in the woods. So it's very strange, but also very addicting. I couldn't stop reading it. Again, very atmospheric. It just had that like magical fairy tale vibe to it. I really didn't end up liking the second book in the series, so I never continued on. It's a 4-book series. It's complete now. So I'm thinking I might go back and try book 3 now, but I absolutely loved book 1. I read it in like a day. I couldn't stop reading it. Very addicting, very smutty if you're into that kind of thing, and just very unique. I've never read anything like this for sure. And Sierra Simone is one of my favorite indie romance authors. I just absolutely love her writing style. I find it very lovely and readable. And yeah, this was a good one. I was surprised by how much I liked this one too. So now for our final category, we have some just plain old contemporary romance, no magic, no supernatural creatures, none of that kind of stuff, but some good smut and a good time. So the first one I have is Birthday Girl by Penelope Douglas. This was actually my final read of 2020 and probably the biggest surprise for me last year. I was not expecting to like this book, let alone love it. I've been curious about this author for a while. She also writes indie romance books, and a lot of people had recommended this one. I'd heard a lot of people say that they loved this one, so I was like, I guess we'll give it a chance. We're following our main character, Jordan. She's 19 years old, and she has to move in with her boyfriend into her boyfriend's father's house due to financial reasons and stuff. Little does she know, she's actually already met her boyfriend's father previously without knowing who he was, and they bonded and like had a connection before they knew who each other was, and now she's moving in with him, and it's a romance between her and her boyfriend's father. So very taboo, very steamy, very smutty, and I freaking loved it. It was so addicting. I read it in 2 days. I couldn't put it down, and I know what you're thinking probably with that description. You're like, that's insane, that sounds ridiculous. Yes, it does, but I found the execution to be so realistic and so believable. I was shocked. The characterization was done so well. It was a slow burn, which I love the slow burns, a gradual build up with this relationship that I just found it super believable and super satisfying. Like once we got to that emotional payoff, I thought it was so well done. I was so pleasantly surprised. Very steamy, very smutty, very well done steam and smut in my opinion. I was so invested in these characters. I had so much fun with this book. I'm really interested in picking up some more of her books now and couldn't recommend this one enough. And then finally, I was hesitant to even put this next one on the list just because it's so popular, so I'm sure you've already heard of it. And that was Beach Read. But this was genuinely one of my favorite books that I read last year. I've seen a lot of conflicting opinions and reviews for this book, but I had such a fun time with this one. It was really, really enjoyable. The only thing I'll say is though, the cover and the title make it look like it's just gonna be like a cutesy rom-com, and I actually think it's a lot more serious and heavy than that. Like, our main character is a writer and she's struggling with writer's block, and her father has recently passed away. So she's dealing with the grief of her father, but she also recently found out that her father had been having an affair for like the majority of her life. So she's like really angry with him and conflicted about that. So those are two like big underlying themes throughout the book, her kind of struggling over this. And she's living in his guest house where he used to have the affair with his mistress, trying to write her next book while she's dealing with writer's block. And she runs into her like arch nemesis from college, and he's also a writer. He writes a completely different genre. She writes romance, he writes literary fiction, and he's also blocked. So the two start to kind of get to know each other again, bond, and they come up with this challenge for each other to write each other's genres to try and see if they can get unstuck. And then it's a romance between the two of them. Again, this was something that I just read really fast. I really enjoyed it. Whenever a book centers on a writer, I tend to just really enjoy them, probably because I'm a writer. But I liked that this book actually had more depth to it than I was expecting from the title and the cover. It wasn't a perfect book by any means, but it was still one of my favorites that I read last year, so I wanted to recommend it just in case any of you haven't picked it up yet. I think it's worth the read. I think it's worth the read maybe more so if you're not a huge romance reader. I think if you're like a very seasoned romance reader, you might not enjoy it as much. But I don't know. I still enjoyed it. Would recommend. So that's the list for today's video. I'll have all of the books linked down below in the description if you want to go check them out. If you do go check them out, please tell me and let me know if you like them. I hope that you do. If you're new here, maybe subscribe and stick around, or give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. It helps out my channel a ton. I currently have 3 books out right now, and my 4th is coming out March 30th. And if you wanted to pre-order it, I would be so appreciative. I'm like 5 pre-orders away from my pre-order goal, which is nuts. It's called The Anti-Relationship Year. It's a new adult romance novel, and it has friends to lovers, a little bit of fake dating, some rock stars, some steamy scenes. It's a good time. But if you're not ready to bite the bullet and pre-order it, you could always just add it to your to-read shelves on Goodreads. I'll have links to all my stuff down below in the description. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I'm at Katesbookdate. Sign up for my author newsletter if you want to. My website's down there. But other than that, I think I'll just see you guys in my next video very soon. Bye.
So hit me. So hit me. So hit me. First a confession. With you, I feel a connection. With